not a really uh, not a really happy occasion at all to be talking about armed resistance in Myanmar. At the same time, I think armed resistance in Myanmar is something that isn't new, that has been going on for many, many decades. And it's quite unfortunate that it has needed to go on for so long. What I mean with armed resistance, I don't want to give you maybe a very precise academic definition. I don't always believe in them. But what I think might be important nevertheless is, especially in a country where, well, we've sadly seen so much conflict and violence over decades now, and in particular now again, to be clear about what I want to talk about when I say armed resistance. Myanmar has been experiencing civil war and armed resistance ever since its independence. And many places in Myanmar have never been governed, of course, by the government, by the junta, by the military, or mostly it's been a military government, of course, in Myanmar. And in many of those pockets that have not been governed, there's been resistance in a form that has taken an armed form for very many years, of course. But that nevertheless, the civil war in Myanmar has also, of course, included many other forms of politics, not only armed resistance, but also very many, for instance, ceasefires, where different ethnic armed organizations and the junta have actually gotten, have actually cooperated even in some limited ways and have not seen as much conflict as we see today. At the same time, of course, we've had resistance without necessarily the armed resistance clarification here in very many ways in Myanmar for very many decades as well. In the civilian opposition forces, of course, across the country, we've seen resistance to military rule, before the coup, throughout also arguably that decade of transition, where we've seen not only progression of or liberalization of the public sphere in a linear fashion, but we've seen also, of course, a lot of regression throughout that time, including, for instance, the way that journalists have been treated, including, of course, the way that parts of society have been treated. And so we've seen, of course, a lot of resistance from the civil society side throughout those years as well, some of which have previously already taken up an armed form when we think about the 1990s and the ABSDF, for instance. But also now, of course, we are seeing a lot of resistance forces in Myanmar taking up arms. So when I think about armed resistance today with you, I want to think about all those different resistance forms that have taken up arms in the past and today. And I want to look at the way that they articulate themselves across the country, because I believe that we are, of course, often under the impression that armed resistance has spread across Myanmar, spread across all of Myanmar, and that might well be the case. As a matter of fact, of course, we are seeing now after the coup armed resistance across the country in ways that we haven't ever before. And these maps illustrate this a little bit. These maps are showing here townships with improvised explosive devices incidents or mine incidences during the last 6 months before the coup and during the first 6 months after the coup. So you can basically see here, of course, that these incidents of improvised explosive devices exploding in different townships have spread across the country. And at the same time as we are, of course, under the impression that armed resistance is occurring everywhere in the country, it does occur in some places more so than in others. I think these maps here don't necessarily show this so well. I mean, they show maybe pockets of armed resistance, if we think about these improvised explosive devices as kind of a proxy to what is armed resistance, so that we can maybe illustrate this at least in some ways. But we don't necessarily, of course, in those maps show the intensity of this. These townships that have been here mapped by the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security, of course, have all seen different explosions in the last 6 months, but this map, of course, is not showing how intense the taking up arms in these different places has been. Maps are always quite imperfect. I will still be using quite a few today, and this is because they provide maybe a good snapshot in time, but at the same time they will always privilege some detail over others. Still, I think that using them for asking about regional differences is quite important, because I do believe that there are regional differences, and I want to basically ask today about what does the geography of the regional differences in terms of the armed resistance, where people take up arms, maybe more so than elsewhere. What does it tell us in Myanmar about the nature as well as the prospects of armed resistance? And hopefully, of course, also this might tell us maybe something about how thinking about the geographies of armed resistance in Myanmar can be helpful for defeating the junta, of course. So while these maps here show that armed resistance has spread across many parts of the country, like I said, they don't necessarily show the different intensity of where this has been happening. Another way of maybe proxying the parts in the country where fighting has been particularly severe, is to look at these very sad maps of internal displacement. This here is a humanitarian snapshot, just the most recent one from December 2021. Here again, of course, we have to qualify that map first of all with a few caveats. This map, of course, does not exclude refugees. It doesn't include people who have fled to Thailand, for instance. It does also not necessarily include internal movements. So this map here shows us where we have, in particular, many internally displaced people, but these displaced people, of course, might have emerged from elsewhere in the country. So we know, of course, at the moment, with the fighting going on the Thai-Burma border in Lei Ko, that there in particular, we have seen a lot of different resistance fighters from across the country who have been based in Lei Ko to get training, for instance, etc., to fight against the junta. That this is particularly also a place at the Thai border where many of those IDP figures that we see on this map here will necessarily include people who have moved from one place to the other. Still, I think that this map can show us a bit more about the intensity of conflict in Myanmar at the moment, which can serve, I think, as a proxy to the intensity of armed resistance in terms of where is it that people take arms in particular, or where they at least travel to be trained to take up arms in particular. And again, I believe that thinking about those geographies is quite important for understanding the nature of taking up arms in Myanmar at present. What we can see here is that since the coup, according to those statistics by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, that since the coup, about 300,000 people have been internally displaced. And these figures are particularly stark in the west of the country, in Sagaing, Chin, and Magway. We've seen particularly many people displaced. In the east of the country, we've seen even more people displaced, where in particular in Kaya state, but also in Karen state and in southern Shan state, we've seen very many displaced people. In the north of the country, we've seen maybe less newly displaced people since the coup. But we have to qualify all of those numbers, of course. Because why is that the case? That, for instance, in Kachin State, we've seen not so many displaced people at the moment. But that is also most likely to do with the fact that in Kachin State, we have already so many displaced people. Because before the coup, of course, Kachin State has seen armed conflict between the Kachin Independence Army and the Burma Army since 2011. And so many, in particular, rural places in Kachin State, well, many of those villages have already been gone. So that means that the kind of small new displacement figures are to be seen in that context where most people have already been displaced, indeed, in large parts of Kachin State. But also the armed clashes between the Kachin Independence Army and the different PDF forces in Kachin State, they've also not only been confined to Kachin State, but also to Sagaing region, to the upper Sagaing region, of course. So those figures, in terms of thinking about the intensity of these armed conflicts here, they will also be reflected in this very high number that we can see of displaced people in Sagaing region. There's a few more caveats when we think about these regional disparities in terms of displacement figures. For instance, Rakhine State and Eastern Shan State are not mentioned by those displacement figures. Here again, of course, we have seen already a lot of displacement, in particular in Rakhine State, before the coup. So many people have already been displaced before that, rather than living maybe in rural communities as they have in other places, as for instance in Magwe. But that, on top of that, of course, this also does already show that not everywhere in the country we have seen the same dynamics or the same levels of armed resistance, particularly in Rakhine State and in Eastern Shan State, where the ethnic armed organizations have engaged less so in the current conflict. And of course, I want to come to explain some of this throughout today. But I think what is also really notable, just from these figures, as imperfect as they will necessarily be, what is also really notable from them is, of course, these really high numbers of internally displaced people in Chin State, Sagaing State, Kayah State, and Karen State. And I find particularly notable the figures of Kayah State and Sagaing and Chin State. And this is because, well, Sagaing and Chin, of course, are much less densely populated places, but also Kayah State is a rather small place after all. And so you have to, of course, see those absolute numbers, here, these overall numbers in context, in comparison to the population dynamics in these places. That, of course, hints to the fact that in some places, well, both the armed resistance, but also, of course, the very brutal state response to that, have been disproportionately so compared to others. So what can explain these regional discrepancies? I believe that we should be looking to the politics of ethnic armed organizations and ethnic politics to explain some of this. Most likely, this will not explain all of this. There are most likely other variables that can explain these regional discrepancies. Of course, for instance, geography itself, that people who are fighting against the regime have to seek shelter in certain territories that are less accessible maybe to the junta than others. But besides those, rather sort of physical geography factors, I think we need to be looking at politics, and here particularly to the politics of EIOs and ethnic politics. So that does not mean that there hasn't been any armed resistance by not ethnic nationalities or ethnic minorities, but by Burman people as well. Of course, there has been, very much so indeed. Like many of the PDF forces rely on people from Yangon, from Mandalay, etc. I still think, though, that the geographies of resistance are strongly shaped by the politics of ethnic armed groups, because when we're seeing the kind of renewed armed resistance today, this is basically overlapping with this long-standing geography of armed resistance and interacting with this in quite important ways. And this is what I try to show today. This here is another very imperfect map. Like I said, many of the maps or all of the maps always just include a snapshot in time. You know? And this year, I think is a rather outdated map. Actually, I think it's from 2014, but still a rather good map, which was made by Burma News International at the time. You know? And it's outdated, of course, because it doesn't show the Arakan army. You know? But it does show, at least illustrates quite well, territories of other ethnic armed organizations. And I want to come back to this map, you know, with that caveat that, of course, it has been a snapshot in time, and some of those territories have changed. In particular, the Arakan army has since moved back to Rakhine State and has indeed captured quite a large amount of territory in Rakhine State. You know. The other caveat to that map is that not all of those territories that you can see here are under control of ethnic armed organization, even though it looks like this, but they are the operations or the territories of operations of ethnic armed organizations. Best illustrated, this is in the case, for instance, of the Kachin Independence Army in the north, of course. You know, the KAO does not control all of those places, but they operate in all of those places. You know? And these are the two caveats I want to mention about this map, because I will be using it a little bit from now on. You know? I want to look at the ethnic armed organization side of things also, because, well, as you will know, most likely, I'm not the first sort of political analyst who's doing this and who's raising the importance of ethnic armed organizations in the current situation in particular. You know? For instance, U Min Sin has been writing about the quote, real kingmakers of Myanmar in terms of the ethnic armed organizations. Thinking that, well, some of them, you know, have actually joined the National Revolution, the NEG, while some of them are hedging the bets maybe, and some of them have actually reaffirmed their ceasefires with the junta as well. You know? So we know, of course, most notably the Karen, but also the Kachin rebel movements have aligned with the NUG and have joined hands with the NUG, including training of PDF forces, including fighting together with PDF forces, rather offensive fighting as well, taking place in both of those territories. You know? And on the other hand, of course, we've seen in particular, the Arakan army, who's been much more careful about joining the kind of nationwide revolution at present, whereas by like in words, kind of very much aligning with the NUG and resenting the junta at present. Despite some minor clashes that we've seen little larger scale instances of armed resistance in Rakhine at the moment. And of course, we've seen other EAOs, including, for instance, the UWSA, who've reaffirmed their ceasefires after the coup. So this graph here has been done by the Australian National University in May 2021. You know? And this again is a snapshot in time, but it maps a little bit those different positionings of ethnic armed organizations that we have seen. And to my knowledge, not that much has changed, you know, since May 2021, actually, which is also an interesting thing to think about, that not that much has changed in terms of the positioning of those EAOs that have taken a position quite early on, many of them, you know, after the coup, and have actually, in many ways, stuck to this. You know? We've seen quite early on that the Kachin Independence Army and the Karen National Union have endorsed the NUG and have engaged in major clashes with the Burma army. We've seen minor clashes by other EAOs, in particular the TNLA, the RCSS, and the MNDAA in the north of the country, who've all condemned the coup or like endorsed the NUG or at least condemned the coup. Then we've seen some armies who've been, well, endorsing or condemning the coup, but not actually clashing much with the Burma army. And many of those, of course, are also rather small armies. If you see, for instance, the CNF or the Lahu Defense Union in the north, these are rather small armies who have, of course, endorsed here the nationwide revolution, but have not seen the same armed mobilization as others. Then we've seen, well, three armies in particular, the UWSA, the SSPP, and the NDAA, who have not only not endorsed the nationwide revolution or condemned the coup in any major way, but also have reaffirmed their ceasefires. So obviously what we see is a rather complex picture of different ethnic armed organizations positioning themselves differently to these new realities after the coup. And that actually materializes in different ways in the different geographies of Myanmar again. And if we go across the map and we think about these differences, then we can start, for instance, in the north of the country and think about Kachin State and northern Kaeng region, where before the coup, of course, well, we've seen already a lot of fighting since 2011, mostly between the KIO and the Burma army in these areas. And after the coup, well, we have seen a continuance of strong armed resistance, and indeed, of course, an escalation of conflict, as the Burma army has also attacked many of the positions of the KIO, but also because the KIO has not only officially endorsed the NUG in the beginning, but also trained PDF units from very early on. But also, and this is something that we've seen both in the KIO case, but also with the current National Union, both of those movements have early on pledged their protection to civilian demonstrations, protesters in the towns that are under control of the Burma army, as for instance, Myitkyina. Very early on, the Kachin Independence Organization has attacked Tatmadaw units outside of Myitkyina to distract the forces in Myitkyina from cracking down on civilian protesters. So we've seen that here, after the coup, the armed resistance has stepped up in a place where already there's been a lot of armed resistance to the military beforehand, including in the time of transition in Myanmar, which hasn't actually translated, as many of you know, in any case, into peace in Kachin State or the north of Myanmar in particular. But similarly, in the Karen State and in Kaya states, we've seen before the coup, we've seen actually, not similarly, we've seen in contrast to Kachin State, we've seen before the coup, we've seen new ceasefires since 2012 in particular, with the KNU and then the NCA in 2015, with different EAOs in the east of the country. But that, and I think this is important to also understand why today we see so much strong armed resistance in the east of the country that has not translated into actual peace in eastern Burma. In particular, I think in Karen State, in Kaya State, there have been a lot of militarized development projects that have continued to displace people in these areas. So when you look, for instance, to current human rights groups reports throughout that kind of decade of transition, we see, of course, that many people have not been displaced by the military or by fighting during that decade of transition, but they've nevertheless seen displacement and continued marginalization under militarized development, infrastructure development projects, for instance, land grabbing, etc., on a large scale. And this is, I think, something that is quite important to explain also why people have taken up arms the same way that they did in both Kaya State and Kayin State after the coup. The KNU has endorsed the NUG, and I want to come back to the KNU in particular a little bit later on in presentation to think about why they have done so, because I don't think it's actually the most straightforward thing for the KNU to do. The KNU has trained and fought together with PDF forces. And also in Kaya, where maybe the local EAO, the KNPP, isn't particularly strong, but we've seen in Kaya in particular a very strong PDF mobilization amongst young people. What we've seen also in Eastern Burma is a particularly strong, brutal state response from the Burma army, including, of course, the targeting of civilian sites in particular, IDP sites, hospitals, towns in particular. So both in Kachin state and in Karen and Kaya states in the east and the north of the country, we've seen very strong armed resistance. When we look to northern Shan state, it's a bit more of a mixed picture. Before the coup, we have seen also renewed fighting, renewed armed resistance against the state, in particular in northern Shan state between the Northern Alliance, or the KIO, the AA, the Kokang Army, and the TNLA. And the Burma army. So that has been one of the most intensely fought bout bases for the last years already. But also, and worryingly, we've seen a lot of fighting between different EAOs, of course, in northern Shan state. So especially between the RCSS and the TNLA, but also the RCSS and the SSPP. We've seen a lot of fighting over territory, in particular in northern Shan state. And this also, points to this rather mixed picture, where on the one hand, we have some EAOs who are aligning with the NUG, in particular the TNLA, the RCSS, and the MNDAA, and who've been fighting and taking up arms against the junta at present as well. But some others who've been reaffirming their ceasefires with the Burma army, and that is the UWSA, the SSPP, and the NDAA. So we have this kind of mixed picture of armed resistance, but what we do certainly see is a lot of armed conflict. Not all, and this is why I was talking a little bit about what I mean with armed resistance before. I think not all we can necessarily see as armed resistance, of course, because the fighting between different EAOs here over territory is not to do with resisting the current state of affairs in Burma, of course. When we move further, then, and again, a more complicated picture, when we move to Rakhine State, here this map, like I said, is completely imperfect, which is why I added the 2 A's here for Arakan Army, because before the coup, of course, we've seen the Arakan Army coming into Rakhine State in 2019, which in a place where the Arakan Army has not actually before commanded territory, as many EAOs have in their particular or respective areas under control. This has sparked most likely some of the most heaviest fighting before the coup in Myanmar. While between 2019 and 2011, when the Burma Army has signed a ceasefire with the Arakan Army just before the coup, and most likely strategically so. Most likely strategically so because this, of course, seems to be one of the rather classic moves of the Burma Army in terms of dividing and ruling the different ethnic armed organizations in the country, like holding basically the back free in that kind of coup that was coming from the dynamics or the fighting with the Arakan Army, which was tying the Burma Army up quite a lot in the west of the country. But of course, also before the coup in Rakhine State, we've seen a lot of other violence, including the communal violence between Buddhist and Muslim communities since 2012, but also, of course, the Burma Army-led genocide against the Rohingya in 2017 and 18 in particular. So while there is undoubtedly a lot of insecurity and violence for local communities, That does not translate to the same extent, it seems, at least, from the outside here, into the same dynamics of armed resistance as it does in other places. And this is, of course, because the Arakan army is at presently taking advantage of the situation, the wider situation in Burma, to consolidate its presence. Here again, I think we have to understand that the Arakan army is coming from a rather different perspective to all of this than other EAOs, a perspective of only having wrestled off territory from the Burma army in very heavy fighting before, and now consolidating its presence, including building governance institutions that other EAOs already have had for many years in their respective areas. So for them, it's rather strategic to not engage in that fighting that, for instance, the KNU and the KIO are doing at the moment. Of course, we've seen some clashes, especially since November, with the Arakan army. But I think what is maybe also to be observed with these clashes is that they're more about territorial incursions between Burma army units into Arakan army territory, or into maybe undemarcated territory. And these kind of clashes have happened for many years in different ceasefire territories. The Burma army has been violating the ceasefire conduct and the territorial arrangements, and often, of course, that those territorial arrangements are rather unclear. So I don't at the moment at least see that these intermittent clashes between the Arakan army and Burma army are the same dynamics of armed resistance as we can see as in other places. So in Rakhine State, it seems that we are ending up with a situation of a rather strong ethnic armed organization, but not necessarily armed resistance, maybe more comparable to Eastern Shan State in that sense, rather than maybe Northern or Eastern Burma at the moment. And finally, I want to come to Chin State and Sagaing State, because I think the situation there is rather particular, and maybe more comparable with Kaya State indeed, because both in these places we've seen before the coup actually some stability, because the ethnic armed organizations in these places have signed a ceasefire, including the so-called nationwide ceasefire agreement, and therefore there wasn't much fighting in these places before the coup. But there have been, well, like I said already, like there's been, of course, marginalization of the most impoverished populations in Burma, in particular, throughout these years as well. There's been some instability, of course, in southern Chin State, in terms of armed conflict before the coup, but that was mostly to do with the Arakan army's incursions into southern Chin State and heavy fighting with the Burma army in these places. After the coup, and I think this is why, again, I was highlighting the high numbers of displaced people in Sagaing and in Chin State in particular. After the coup, we've seen a very massive mobilization of civilian resistance forces that were operating or are operating outside the EAO the Chin National Forces EAO in Chin State, and are actually organized under the PDF umbrella, or the Chinland Defense Forces today. So the armed mobilization, armed resistance here is very strong, but this is going beyond the existing EAOs. And of course, we've seen a very brutal state response throughout these places in particular, something I want to come back to as well. So when we think about explaining then these different positionings, what has happened in terms of shifting before and after the coup in these different places, I think we encounter some rather immediate responses in terms of explaining these. And one, of course, is the highlighting of history and ethnic politics. Many commentators point out that why would EAOs care for a conflict that often from the EAO perspective is seen as a conflict essentially between civil and military forces in places in central Burma, basically. Kind of civil-military relations conflict between mostly Burman people is often pointed out. What is also often pointed out is that during the time of democratization in the last decade, that particular transition did often not bring peace, to ethnic nationality communities. So some of the ethnic nationality communities that are not the communities of ethnic nationalities, but the ethnic armed organizations that are not joining in, why would they now basically be fighting for or endorsing the NUG is often something that we hear. And in particular, of course, because in the 1990s, some NGOs have aligned with what was the NCGUB at the time. So in a way, very parallel to what is happening now, a shadow or exile government led by the Democratic Opposition Forces of Burma, where especially the KNU aligned with the NCGUB before and did not, for instance, sign a ceasefire in the 1990s when most other EAOs have signed ceasefires, which resulted in rather catastrophic losses and defeats for the KNU, including the loss of their headquarters in Manaplo. So, but why then would actually the KNU endorse the NUG now? I think this is actually the better question almost, because from a rather perspective of the history and ethnic politics, maybe argumentations, where the KNU, why would they actually endorse the NUG, train PDF fighters from other places in Burma, etc.? And of course they have, And I think this is the puzzle that we should be going with, that we should be explaining. So while I'm sympathetic to the arguments, that of course there are these different divides, I also think we have to go beyond this. Another thing that is often raised, I'm just seeing that there are some questions or in the chat. Okay, let me just double check the time. Okay, I will talk for about 10 more minutes, if that's okay. And then I want to rather, cut my own talk short and let's do questions and interactions. And I'm sure actually many answers and responses after that as well, okay? Super. So another thing that is often raised in explaining those different positionings is, of course, international politics. So one thing that is often pointed out to is the stance of China, for instance, and that some of the EAOs that are, for instance, not endorsing the NUG have a rather close tie with China. In particular, here the UWSA, for instance. But I'm not inclined so much for this explanation, because the MNDAA has very good relations to China as well, arguably, and they are nevertheless engaging very much in armed resistance against the Burma army at present, and have done so throughout the last decade. They've been fighting very heavily indeed against the Burma army in the last decade. So I don't think that this explanation that EAOs are basically the pawns of China actually is very fruitful. I would actually think that different EAOs have their own strategies and are indeed their own agents. The other explanation that is partly also true, but maybe again not completely satisfying, is this divide and rule strategy by the Burma army itself. So having a ceasefire with the Arakan army just before engaging, or before coupping and engaging in conflict with a lot of other opposition forces in the country at the same time. We've seen this, of course, before. We've seen the Burma army dealing a ceasefire, for instance, with movements in the north while fighting movements in the south in the 1990s, and then turning these tables around after 2011, having ceasefires with movements in the south and fighting movements in the north. But then again, I think that EAOs are not just responding to their external environment in terms of not just responding to what the Burma army is doing, but are also having their own strategic considerations. And those strategic considerations, and this will be my sort of last argument for today in terms of explaining this, I think are particularly framed or shaped by bottom-up pressures on different EAOs, by grassroots politics, by grassroots pressures across the different environments or communities. And this is when we look, for instance, at conflict systems, like this. I think we have to appreciate that the kind of illustration on the left is rather incomplete. A conflict doesn't only look like a conflict between different homogeneous actors, where, for instance, that kind of black circle here might be the state, and those smaller circles might be non-state resistance movements. But those resistance movements, including the state most likely, but here looking at armed resistance in particular, those resistance movements often, of course, contain of different nodes, are rather heterogeneous actors, of different factions, for instance, and different groupings. And I think this is something that I've been trying to highlight in particular in my own studies of armed struggle in Myanmar, where I've been looking in particular not only at the different maybe factions in groups like the KNU or the KIO, but in particular into the relationship between the leadership of EAOs and their strategic considerations and the way that they are being shaped by bottom-up pressures, by the pressures of grassroots, wider society, within which I argue EAOs and different armed resistance movements in general are necessarily embedded in. So what I'm trying to say here is that we actually need to be attentive to the ways that different armed resistance movements, in particular those movements that have been existing for so long in Myanmar, have tied into their respective societies and the voice that their respective societies actually have on these movements. So just to illustrate this, I think we've seen for the KNU different moves at the same time, since the coup. We've seen some leaders in the KNU who have been trying to be more diplomatic, with including the new junta. Some leaders who've been rather pragmatically dealing with the Burma army for quite some time. But we've also seen other leaders, and in particular grassroots pressures across the current society that have been rather, I would think, careful, about reaffirming a ceasefire and have actually taken up arms, even though some of the leadership level of the KNU have tried to be more pragmatic in their dealing with the junta. So this is just to illustrate the way that the KNU here is a rather heterogeneous movement that acts, or that whose strategic considerations and actually acts are shaped by these different pressures. One thing, for instance, here is the way that different Karen civil society organizations have condemned different statements that were coming out from different leaders about negotiating with the junta as something that they don't see as particularly satisfying at all at the present time. And I think this is important for thinking about the differences that we see in those different ethnic armed organizations, because it is quite clear that on the grassroots level, on the streets, whether it's in Yangon, whether it's in Pa'an, I think we've seen very clearly that across society in Burma, whether it's Burmese people, whether it's Rakhine people, whether it's Karen people or Wa people as well, people have joined in rejecting very strongly the new military junta, maybe from different positions, of course. And Chosan Line, for instance, has written, I think, a very good article from where I pinched the left picture here, about the way that, of course, for ethnic nationalities, the question has never been since the coup about restoring Myanmar politics, but about remaking Myanmar politics, about remaking Myanmar politics in a way that takes into account, the problems of the problems that ethnic nationalities have faced in the state and democracy before as well. But while we've seen these different grassroots pressures across the country, from different ethnic nationality groups, we've seen them sometimes translate, I think, into the positioning of their respective EAOs very strongly against the junta and very much in favor of the NUG and supporting armed resistance as a way forward, whereas in some places, of course, not so, right? And again, I think this is not to do with the different motivations on the grassroots level, which I believe from what I can read and talk to people are rather similar in different places of the country. But they, of course, have to do with the way that those pressures can actually translate into EAO strategies on the leadership level. And this is where, of course, different EAOs function rather differently, where there is a different public sphere, if you want so, to the KNU or to the KAO that are much more susceptible to pressures from Karen or Kachin activist groups, rather than, for instance, the UWSA or the Arakan Army, which have a much less formed sorts of public sphere, arguably, where these bottom-up pressures, can necessarily translate into the strategic considerations on leadership. And then again, of course, from a purely strategic consideration, non-intervention of the Arakan Army or the UWSA can also make sense. And this is where, of course, in some of the EAOs, those grassroots pressures formulate strategies more so than in others. Lastly, I want to return here to Chin State and Sagaing and Kaya State as well, because I think what is so remarkable about the armed resistance that we've seen here is that the grassroots pressures have translated into very strong armed resistance against the junta, but beyond the existing ethnic armed organizations. So here we know, of course, of all the rather courageous and brave stories, but also very brutal reprisals of the states that we've seen in Chin State, where people have picked up Tumi rifles to face a genocidal army. And I think for explaining why both in Chin State and in Kaya State in particular, we've seen this very strong-hearted response by local communities. We have to, again, go back to the time before the coup, where in both of those places, we've seen an official end to the formal conflict with a ceasefire between, for instance, the CNF and the Burma Army, or the KNPP and the Burma Army. But these ceasefires have never translated into like any experience amongst local people that resembles peace or security. They've actually translated into rather securitized development projects that have again displaced people from their homelands, but also into development projects that really follow this rather racialized logic, that has been part of the DNA of the state in Myanmar, unfortunately, since its independence. And this is, something that has been brought into these places by, for instance, the Natala, the Ministry of Border Affairs, and its kind of development projects that have always seen ethnic nationalities, for instance, in the Chin Mountains, as particularly inferior, on a rather racialized logic. And I do think that this experience, also this kind of, these ethnic politics, we have to take seriously for understanding both the seriousness of armed resistance that we've been seeing in these places, amongst people who've taken up arms, even though their particular EAOs, with very little battlefield capabilities in any case, have maybe joined by words, but not so much by deeds, because also the CNF doesn't have that many forces, indeed. But it also, I think, is quite important to make us aware of these racialized logics here, to understand that particularly brutal violence, that the junta has unleashed, on communities in Kaya, in Chin State, in Sagaing region, that I've been trying to illustrate with these also numbers, of course, before of displaced people. I mean, in Mindato and Tanlang, I think the violence there, the logic of counterinsurgency, when the counterinsurgency was using snipers to snipe down people who were trying to restore the water supplies, to really deny people of their actual living and existence. This has followed, I think, this particular racialized genocidal logic that has also driven the violence against the Rohingya people, for instance. And that is not to deny all the brutal violence that the junta has unleashed on peoples across Myanmar, including, of course, on Burmese people in Myanmar. But I think it is also to just highlight why those violences are of such a brutal extent in some places, more so than in others. And this, of course, these violences also, I think, reaffirm, armed resistance in people, because the experience of violence, of course, is what mobilizes people in the first place. And I think this is something that we've seen in particular in Burma now with, while armed resistance is, of course, also a measure of defense. This is why we're talking about people's defense forces. And I think analytically, this is a rather correct category. I want to just end with kind of a few implications of what I've been trying to do here in terms of looking at those different geographies of armed resistance and violence, and maybe a little bit of an outlook as well. I think there's been something remarkable happening in Myanmar. Obviously there's been lots of upheavals, and I don't have to tell you, you are, of course, much more affected by it than I am. And I think, nevertheless, there's also been something rather remarkable in terms of rather tectonic shift that's been happening in Myanmar. And armed resistance has been part of this. Has been part of this on maybe three levels. On a level of ideas, where I do believe that the NUG and that idea of the federal army, can indeed act as a paradigm shift in the country. And I know that there's been a lot of critique that's been leveled against the NUG as well, etc. But I do think that the NUG is trying very hard, to connect with different ethnic nationalities. For instance, when we look at the different appointments that they've been making, but also this idea of the federal army. Now, whether or not a federal army will ever materialize, I don't think is as important as the idea is, actually, because the idea takes seriously ethnic armed organizations as building blocks of this federal army, rather than what the scam of a peace process that's been had before was always demanding, which was the kind of demobilization of ethnic armed organizations as such, which most likely was never a feasible proposition in the first place. The other level, I think, on which armed resistance is operating at the moment, and which I think does constitute a rather serious tectonic shift in Myanmar, is what I would think of an everyday spheres of solidarity level, where on the one hand people are fighting side by side. PDFs are fighting together with EAOs, different peoples who have actually not understood also their different conditions before, and what is, after all, a rather fragmented country, are learning of each other's fate, on social media as well, right? So you don't have to I don't know, be in the mountains fighting with a PDF, to be more aware these days, of their conditions in another place of the country, And also, it seems the solidarity thing, people are caring for each other like rarely before. And these are maybe just anecdotes now, but I think one thing that I found particularly interesting is how people were celebrating each other's forces. For instance, the dancing of KIO soldiers on social media, but also the dancing of PDF soldiers. The way that people were celebrating each other's resistance, but also each other's humanity. I thought that this was really powerful. And then lastly, I think, and this is something that I want to end this talk with, is to come back maybe to some post-colonial theory ideas, where armed resistance is a practice, that for post-colonial thinkers, for anti-colonial thinkers who are thinking about anti-colonial resistance and liberation movements, where armed struggle itself has long been a practice that has a liberatory dimension inbuilt in it, where armed struggle becomes maybe a practice that is almost necessary, for transforming societies. And I want to end with a quote from a article written by Mark Laffer and Tarek Bakawi, who've been, I think, encapsulating this, in a rather pregnant way, in a rather potent way, and they're writing, quote, "To advise the weak that they should not take up arms, but instead await liberation at the hands of the West is wishful thinking, given the historical record of the West in this regard." And I think this is something we can unfortunately very much relate to in the case of Burma. And then they continue, and they write, "In contrast to those today who place their hopes upon Western use of force, upon the auspices of the United Nations or the international community, generations of Southern resistance movements, or resistance movements in the global South, instead put their faith in their own use of force. For Frantz Fanon, Mao Zedong, and others, the use of force by the weak themselves was an inherent and useful dimension of liberation projects." And I don't want to obviously glorify, violence whatsoever, but I want to be realistic about it. I want to be realistic in the way of what people and peoples across Burma are facing. And they are facing a rather genocidal junta, and they are facing also a context where the outside world is not helping at all. And I think in that sense, the armed resistance that we've been seeing across the country has been transformative, has been rather transformative, I think, on these three levels. And I hope that understanding some of those still geographies of armed resistance, where maybe it's not just that the whole country has taken up arms just everywhere, but the whole country has taken up arms in different places, that understanding why that is, can hopefully be useful, for thinking about the prospects of armed resistance, and hopefully, I think, resistance more generally in Myanmar, because I don't think that armed resistance and resistance are necessarily binary things. I think it's more like a spectrum, and particularly when we think about many of the people who've taken up arms more recently in Myanmar, there are of course people who've taken up placards on the streets before, right? And this is maybe just to kind of sort of demonstrate that point, that those things are not necessarily binaries. But I hope that some of this was maybe useful or thought-provoking, for thinking about what is happening. But I'm sure that many of you don't only have questions, but rather insightful comments. And so feel free. I will stop my presentation now. Maybe I can also stop the sharing of my slides. To make comments, to make remarks. And please do so critically. I'm sure that there have been many things that one can question, in my interpretation as well. So please feel free to do that as well. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to an interaction with you now.
Hello, Dr. David Brenner. Thank you so much for the great talk, and it's our honor to have you today. So I'm Kate, and please let me assist you in the Q&A section of this webinar. And I, of course, some questions anonymously sent to us, and please let me read out for you, sir. And question number 1 is, many people think that military is the main reason for armed conflicts in Myanmar. Do you think that there can be no armed conflicts if military dictatorship is removed?
I agree. The military, the Burma army, how it has built itself as the main institution in the country is certainly the root of the problem here. The Burma army has, from the outset, and I mean the outset of the Burma army today in particular, which I believe is the Burma army of Ne Win, rather than General Aung San. So the Burma army of Ne Win, so since 62 and up until now, has of course been an army that has relied on the perpetuation of internal conflict for its own standing, for its own position, for its own power, for its own even material resources. The way that it has institutionalized itself as a state within the state, that relies on always having an enemy to fight. The way that war making has become state making in Myanmar since independence, I think proves in many ways, illustrates and evidences in many ways the way that the Burma army is at the root of armed conflict, and has sparked, including the armed resistance, of course, that we see today. That is maybe the first part of your question, because I think there's two parts. The other part of your question is, well, if the Burma army was to now go away or dissolve, or let's imagine a world without the Burma army today, would that mean an end to armed conflict? And I would say that unfortunately, it might not be quite as straightforward. And that is despite the Burma army being the number one factor for the armed conflicts that we are seeing in Burma. But why I'm saying that it's not so straightforward is basically because remember, for instance, when I was speaking about Northern Shan State, where we have different EAOs also fighting against each other over territory. And this is not to single them out, but I do think that, of course, decades of armed conflict. And again, we have to remember that many of the border areas that are now seeing very heightened armed conflict have seen armed conflict ever since the independence of the country. But in many of these places, of course, we do see grievances that aren't simply EAOs versus the state or armed resistance forces versus the Burma army. We see, of course, that the conflict has ingrained into so many ways where now we have different EAOs fighting against each other, or we also have different tensions between different communities. This is, of course, the way that the Burma army has ingrained a particular version of an ethnic conflict into the country. So I don't think that people are born as cats and dogs, and therefore they just have to fight each other. I think these things are, of course, manufactured. That ethnic difference turns into ethnic conflict is a thing that the Burma army has made sure that this turns out to be like this. But of course, also, excuse me, this was my laptop. But of course, also we have to go back further to the time of the colonial regime in Burma, and the way that ethnicity has been used to govern people in Burma and to pitch people against each other. So, of course, this is something where, well, if you just remove the Burma army now from the equation, I don't think that necessarily all of a sudden there won't be any conflict in Burma anymore. But, and I want to come back to what I was saying at the end of my presentation today, I do think that what we're seeing now in terms of those spheres of solidarity, amongst people, that this does actually make me hopeful, that people can once and hopefully when the Burma army will, in one way or the other, be dissolved in its current form, be able to come together. So I don't think that this conflict is baked in forever, but has, that there are these real transformative capabilities and the hopes at the moment as well.
Thank you, sir, for the great discussion on the first questions. And another question is, NUG is now trying to get international recognition, and they need to show that they have effective control of a certain area. Which area is the most likely place for that in Myanmar?
Okay, interesting. I'm not sure whether necessarily the territorial control is a precondition, for international recognition. I think we've seen, of course, most states being rather cautious of recognizing the NUG as it is at the moment. But I think this is actually to do rather with very many other factors. Unfortunately, most and foremost, this kind of status perspective of the world, where basically, the Burma army, as unfortunate as it is, has captured the state and its institutions. And from, it doesn't matter whether it's Western states, or whether it's China or other states. For most of them, actually, the de facto rule, of the Burma army over the state makes the Burma army the state, as illegitimate as it is. So what you're saying is an interesting comment, actually, because you're basically saying that if the NUG should be recognized, or can be recognized, that it needs territory. I'm not sure whether it's a very interesting thought, and maybe most likely there is something to this, but most likely that would entail then the command of the majority of Burma as territory rather than a pocket of territory, which should give us to think in particular in the direction that you're asking. If you think about those geographies that I was talking today, it's quite clear where there are pockets of particular strong armed resistance. And these pockets are, of course, related to the previous conflict dynamics and which EAOs have pledged allegiances to the NUG. So at the moment, of course, in the east of Thailand, or in the east of Myanmar on the Thailand border, and on the north of Myanmar, there most likely are places where the NUG can claim to have this foothold, but it can only do so, of course, if it is endorsed by the different EAOs that have liberated those areas before. What happens in Chin State is very interesting, I think, because in Chin State, again, there has not been a particular EAO before. Like the CNF has been there, but it wasn't in control of the same amount of territory at all. And what happens there to the India border is most likely interesting in terms of how PDFs can actually wrestle off territory from the Burma army. So this is maybe a space to watch, but I don't. I see the logic of your question. I find it very, very intriguing. Basically, being the NUG needs territory for it to be recognized internationally. But I don't think that most likely the NUG can claim a fragment or non-fragmented part of territory anytime soon. So I would say that the more short-term strategy might need to be to like seek endorsement from different EAOs who already have these different territories. And they're most likely the Arakan army, as you are all aware, as much as I am, or even more, of course, will be a key factor. And shifting the kind of different positionalities on this kind of graph that I showed before in favor of the NUG, I think is something that might be the more sort of feasible short-term strategy here.
Thank you, sir. And we have got another question in the Q&A box. So that is, and resistance already occur in Myanmar, have a plan to fight to military council by Quad and NATO, including USA.
Kate, sorry, I'm which question was this? I'm having a variety, so I'm a little confused.
Please let me read out again.
Please,
and
yeah.
Resistance already occur in Myanmar, have a plan to fight to military council by Quad, QUAD, and NATO and ATO, including USA.
I don't think, unfortunately, that NATO or the USA is planning to take any action, military action in Burma. I mean, NATO is a defensive alliance, of different Western Atlantic treaty organization states, that only takes military action normally when it sees itself being attacked. So what happened in Afghanistan was NATO saw itself being attacked in terms of 9/11. However, that construction, actually worked out. NATO did some intervention in Kosovo before, as well as in Libya. That's true. Libya was sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. Kosovo was not. And I think we have to just remind ourselves that both of those cases were happening in a rather different time and space in international politics. I don't think that either of those interventions were ever out of altruism or something like this. But Kosovo was in southeast of Europe. So that was something where Europe was basically, after in particular the Yugoslavia war, was trying to do something different in its own neighborhood, so to speak. And Libya was a case where a lot of different real strategic interests and if you want, so self-interests of different intervening parties came together. The interesting thing, and I think it might relate to this question on R2P also in the chat here, is if you think about Libya as an R2P intervention. This is something that might most likely be interesting to discuss, because the UN Security Council resolution that was passed in favor for an R2P intervention in Libya, it was passed because Russia and China were not vetoing this resolution, but they were abstaining. And why did they abstain? I think they abstained for two reasons. The first reason was that they didn't have an immediate interest in Libya as much, as, for instance, China has in Myanmar. This is the one reason. But the other reason, so this is the reason that kind of makes me not very hopeful at all, for any international political intervention. The other reason that can make us maybe a little more hopeful, but in a very qualified way, is that in Libya, the Arab League and the African Union played a huge role. So what that means is both the Arab League and the African Union were actually voting in favor. They were supporting the intervention in Libya at the time, which dampened, the otherwise inherent resistance of Russia and China, because it was very difficult for Russia and China to argue against the regional organizations wanting to intervene in Libya. What that means for Myanmar, of course, is that if ASEAN were to take any kind of reasonable leadership that they have not, that would most likely be the most effective way of changing the dynamics in the United Nations Security Council dynamics in terms of resolutions passed on Myanmar. And whether that is a military intervention, which I don't necessarily think is coming, or other sanctions, which might well be useful and important. For instance, sanctioning airplane fuel. You don't have to have almost a no-fly zone if you have a embargo on the fuel for airplanes coming into Myanmar. Then the airplanes cannot fly anymore, right? Not my idea. I blatantly stole this just now from the current human rights group, who was also lobbying for this. And I think it's a very sensible idea, which of course is similar to an arms embargo. But for these things to work, also, of course, there needs to be a strong UN resolution. And a strong UN resolution most likely can only come, this is what the case of Libya would show, if there is more resolute force behind ASEAN. And we all know how useless, frankly speaking, ASEAN has been in the recent crisis, but maybe also before. And that nevertheless, I think the recent crisis has shown that ASEAN can move more than some would have expected before, where ASEAN is also not a homogeneous actor. But for instance, Malaysia or Indonesia have been much more sensible and pushing the envelope in ASEAN much more than other member states of ASEAN. And in that sense, I think there is something, if you think about getting to some form of United Nations response that is more actually concrete and useful than anything that has been done up until now, I believe that the way to this is via the ASEAN mechanisms, and via convincing the kind of unconvinced member states of ASEAN, such as Thailand, for instance, in particular, that their particular positioning is wrong, right? So if you think about a strategy of how to intervene in which places of international politics to come to this kind of endpoint. And at the same time, and then I will, just stop with this, but I think just addressing a few different questions that are relating to this. At the same time, I don't think, that any of this, unfortunately, will ever lead to a situation where one would have effective military intervention from the outside. But I do think that it can lead to a situation where there's more forceful sanctioning mechanisms that can nevertheless, I think, help the resistance in Myanmar winning this fight.
Thank you so much, sir. Please let me read one more question. What are your thoughts on the argument often held by Western observers that violent resistance movements are little likely to succeed, and when they do succeed, they have little chance of producing a democratic and peaceful country? Can Myanmar and its particular content prove that argument to be wrong?
I think so, yeah. Frankly speaking, I think so, for two reasons. The first reason is, yes, armed resistance might have little chance of winning in many cases. That is true. But on the other hand, this doesn't mean that it cannot win. And I think we've seen many places in the world where protracted armed resistance has actually produced the outcomes of transforming different regimes, of forming new countries. And so I don't think that armed resistance is necessarily as much of a hopeless case as some other observers would make it out to be. But I do think that the armed resistance, and this is also maybe in relation to your second question, in terms of what kind of outcomes it can produce, I do think that the resistance that we see in Burma at the moment needs, of course, to be more unified to produce that outcome. And again, I think this is something that I was trying to highlight in the end of my talk, is that there are these different forces that actually produce much more homogeneous, or much more unifying movements in Burma now than ever before. So I don't think that these kind of commonly portrayed ideas on armed resistance from especially also Western scholars are so applicable to Burma or elsewhere. Look, for instance, so many places in the world, especially places in the global south that have been colonized. Many of them, they didn't just receive their liberty, their independence by their colonial overlords. Many of them actually fought for it. Look at Vietnam, for instance. Look at Algeria, for instance, right? Many of those places have not received, external, international help for this, unfortunately, and they should have. And I do think that Myanmar should as well. But it's, of course, a bit hypocritical to be like, Myanmar won't be helped by any other places. And at the same time, people cannot take up arms to fight for their own independence or liberty and justice as they do. And so I would actually hold it there with a post-colonial scholarship that sees, first of all, armed struggle as often a necessary part for liberation to happen. And then I would think that the resistance that we're seeing at the moment also has this transformative prospect for the country in terms of producing these spheres of solidarity that are very necessary for the second concern of Western political observers to be defeated, which is basically that concern that armed resistance cannot produce a democratic or stable or peaceful, or however you want to define it, outcome in the end. And I think, again, many of the kind of anti-colonial struggles that we've seen in the world actually proved that this was not the case. Maybe just one more thing about this, because I think it's a really important question. When we think about these anti-colonial struggles in different places of the world that have defeated colonial powers and have therefore then resulted in the establishment of independent states, there's, I think, two challenges that they have faced afterwards, in particular, in terms of building new states. The first challenge was how these places have formally been independent, but how the international forces have never left them to actually be independent. So what I mean with this is the constant interference into their affairs have often produced places that are much less stable, maybe, and much less democratic and much more prone to authoritarianism than they would have been otherwise. Think, for instance, about the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the biggest states in sub-Saharan Africa. They've had post-colonial leaders, for instance, Patrice Lumumba, who was fighting for independence and who was then becoming an independent leader. But his work was sabotaged by the former colonial overlords, by Belgium, but also by the US at the time, for geopolitical interests, for instance. So one thing, of course, when we think about these arguments that armed resistance cannot necessarily produce peaceful and democratic outcomes as well, in what context can it produce this? What international contexts are there for it to do so? And the other thing is, and I think that is something that, of course, has been problematic in most nation-building processes, including in Myanmar in particular, even though Myanmar's independence wasn't the result of an armed struggle. But nevertheless, these things, I think, relate to different, projects of nation building. Is the process of nation building itself, right? And I think there, for Myanmar and for other places, nation building, as much as it needs to appreciate ethnic grievances and ethnic communities and different cultures and all of that, cannot purely be based on ethnic politics, right? Because otherwise it will, unfortunately, most likely produce divided societies again. So in that sense, I think it's not about armed resistance itself, but it's about the ideas that stand behind what is being resisted against and what is being fought for, right? And this is, very much what I was saying, why I think that, for instance, the NUG is doing a very serious job in terms of appreciating the different ethnic grievances in the country and addressing these with different ministerial appointments and trying to actually to do better than what we've seen before. And that is going to be much more important, for, I think, democracy and peace in the country than how democracy and peace in the country is being achieved in the first place. I hope that answers the question a bit, but it's a very important question, because I think this is something we hear quite a lot, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with.
Thank you so much, sir, for the fruitful discussion on it. And I know that we have very limited time, but if you don't mind, could you please cover like 2 more questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, so what will be WUSA role in contemporary politics of Myanmar? Do you think that WUSA involvement in current resistance is critical to defeat the middle?
I think, of course, it would help, right? Absolutely. I think there's no question about if UWSA and or the Arakan army would join into the resistance against the Tatmadaw at the moment, that no question this would be a game changer. No? The question is, of course, can the game be changed without their involvement, right? And I would think it can. I would think it can if, for instance, the Arakan army can be brought on board, right? And I would think that the Arakan army is much more susceptible to pressures from across society in Myanmar than the UWSA necessarily is. So yeah, the UWSA would be critical, but I do also believe that not only most likely will it not join into the current struggle in Myanmar, but also that the current struggle in Myanmar can most likely be effective without the UWSA. I don't think the UWSA will fight against the resistance forces, right? I don't think they have any interest in this either. I think there is maybe other armed groups that we should also be looking at that we don't normally speak about, just very briefly. One thing that I thought was from my understanding, and again, I need to always qualify my understanding as an outside analyst who has limited, of course, insight onto some of the dynamics on the ground. But from what I understand, what I thought was really important and interesting is the way that different so-called BGF forces, the border guard forces, so different militias who are fighting for the military, how the military has mobilized them, for instance, in Karen state to fight against the KNU, for instance, and how some of the leaders of those BGF forces have agreed to do so and have their own, for instance, business interests, etc., for doing so. But at the same time, the morale amongst the soldiers of those BGF forces was very low, because they were not fighting against the KNU as they did maybe in the 1990s, against the fall, in the case of the fall of Manaplo, they were fighting against the KNU for their own interests in many ways. But they were fighting against the KNU in more recent days in a context where actually many of the soldiers do not want to necessarily join in the fight, because of course they are also part of a society that is in general upheaval against the junta, and also they don't have an intrinsic motivation at the moment to fight the KNU at all, right? So in that sense, I think there's something really interesting to think about in terms of all those other different armed groups that exist in the country, that one would normally, maybe think of kind of proxies of the Tatmadaw because, they're officially BGF forces, etc. But I don't think, it's so straightforward, right? I don't think that many of them have an intrinsic motivation to fight against EAOs or armed resistance forces at the moment, even though some of them are being forced similarly, as Tatmadaw soldiers as well. On the lower ranks, of course, we know that there's a lot of force going on. But I think actually that there's something really interesting to take note of here to think about, okay, how can, in all the kind of strategies that are being had at the moment to make people defect from the Burma army, I think actually another target can and should be, those different BGF militia forces, because I think that they, in many ways, have an even more intrinsic motivation to actually not fight against the armed resistance at the moment, and maybe even join them. So that might be something, to consider as well. It's many different armed groups that we normally maybe don't talk about at the moment.
Thank you again, sir. The last question. In terms of capacity, if all EAOs are united against Myanmar army, can they win?
Absolutely. I think this certainly, if they were all united, the Myanmar army, as big as it is, most likely does not. Most likely would face at some point, the end to it, and that is. Well, if you think about guerrilla force or guerrilla warfare, the usual idea is that about 10% of guerrilla forces can not necessarily defeat the enemy, but can keep the enemy at bay. That means that for guerrilla warfare, of course, defeat is not always on the military battlefield, but is to actually, make, for instance, fragment, for instance, the state's army, by keeping up protracted resistance. And in that sense, of course, I think if they were all to join together, we would face a very capable adversary to the Burma army. And I understand that this, of course, is often the aspiration. I don't necessarily think, unfortunately, that it's going to be feasible to have all of those different EAOs join together. Again, some of them are even fighting against each other, unfortunately, in Northern Shan State, right? But I do think that shifting, this graph that I showed before, is possible. And I do think that it might take some time, but I do think it's possible to shift more EAOs who have or who are inclined inherently to stand up against the regime, as for instance the Arakan army, but who haven't done so yet for their own strategic considerations. That some of them can be actually changed into joining the nationwide struggle at the moment. And I think in the end, this is key. Whether it necessitates all of the EAOs to join together is a different question, which I don't think it actually maybe is necessarily the case that this needs to happen. Maybe I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. David Brenner, for the great discussion and for the great talk for today. So, dear all participants, I'm sorry that we won't be able to cover all the questions due to the time concern, but I believe we have discussed a lot and covered enough for today's topic. So please let me end our webinar here. And once again, thank you everyone for your active participation. And thank you very much, Doctor, for the great talk.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for all the great interaction. I'm sorry that I couldn't maybe answer all of the different questions. And I hope it was useful, even though, of course, you know much more about the actual on the ground situations than I do. I just hope it was useful to maybe have some reflection from the outside, and some, I don't know, categorization, for instance, and